Now, that isn't all, because when I interpret data, I can't interpret it without ideas, without concepts, without theories, axioms, laws, principles, some way to give meaning. Implicit in all interpretation is a mini theory, a concept, an idea. So now I can take your interpretation and I can burrow into it to try to find the key idea, the central concept, the central theory of parenting that is embedded in your interpretation of the children's behavior. So I pay close attention to the way you interpret your children's behavior, and I see a little theory of behavior implicit in that interpretation. So if your interpretation is that when they do what I tell them, they are good, and when they don't do what I tell them, they are bad. If that is embedded in your interpretive patterns, then I know you have a theory that says we either behave or we don't behave, and parents always know what is best, and children are morally deficient when they don't respond to this. This is a certain very simplistic theory of parenting. But however, that may be the theory that is embedded in your parental patterns. So I know there are always concepts and ideas. By the way, if I'm a good student, I know that I cannot think within a subject unless I know the concepts of the subject. Let me put it another way. I cannot think within a subject unless I learn the vocabulary of the subject. I can't do chemical thinking without chemical concepts. I can't do anatomical thinking without anatomical concepts. I can't talk about baseball if I have no baseball terminology. I need the ideas, I need the vocabulary. Now notice how few students value the terminology, the vocabulary, because they don't realize it's essential to thought. You have to have a vocabulary in which you think. But if they knew this as a universal part of thinking, they would always look for that vocabulary. Give me the most basic terms that you use. And they would seek those terms because they would know these are powerful organizers for thinking. But when you form concepts and theories, there is something you can't avoid doing, and that is making some assumptions. You have to take something for granted. You can't figure out everything simultaneously. You must assume this to figure out that. Because in order to seek to understand, you can't have everything up in the air at the same time. So the mind must take things for granted. I may take for granted at some moment that my observations are accurate. Or for a few moments, I have to at least take for granted my theory is plausible in order to try it out and give it a chance. If I thought it was absurd from the beginning, I wouldn't try it out even. So I take some things for granted. You take for granted that your students are capable of learning. You take for granted that you can do something that will affect their motivation. You take for granted various things. You take for granted that you know something worth teaching. You take for granted many, many things. Now, since you cannot avoid taking some things for granted, you know that you can always question assumptions. Give me some of the most basic assumptions of history as a subject. Or let's look at this particular page in history. What is the historian at this point taking for granted? In this proof, in mathematics, what are we taking for granted at this particular point? Notice in geometry, assumptions are usually stated explicitly. Given this, assume this, can you prove that? So in that particular case, the assumptions are laid out for you. But that's not typical in inquiry. Very often, in most fields, the assumptions are in the background, not brought out explicitly as they are in mathematics. But since I know that assumptions are always present in the background, I can then look for them. Now, notice I want to compare this to a kind of pseudo-understanding of critical thinking. Sometimes people will say, don't make assumptions. This is unintelligible. There is no such thing. Cannot be done. But this is intelligible. Be careful about the assumptions that you do make. Think about the fact that you are making assumptions and try to make them with some criticality. with some sensitivity to whether the assumptions you're making do make sense. Okay? So that's another dimension of thinking. I know it. I can always use it. Now let me look at the questions I can ask if I've internalized this. I walk into any class as a student. I read any book. I listen to any person. And here are questions that occur to me. What is the purpose? What is the agenda? What are we trying to accomplish here? What are the questions? Where is the information coming from? How is the information being interpreted? What is the basic vocabulary or ideas I need to understand this? And what is being taken for granted? I remember I took a sociology course, a kind of introduction to sociology at Northern Illinois University. And I wrote all my test questions with this little preamble, according to the lectures. And then I wrote out the answers. Because there was a lot that I didn't accept in the thinking because of one fundamental assumption that the sociologist who taught the course made. It was this, that all human behavior can be predicted if sociology develops in a rich and full way. In other words, that all human behavior is determined by social structures. I didn't think that was true. I don't today think that it is true. But it was a kind of premise of the instruction. And so I learned the point of view, and I thought sociologically within that as an exercise of thought, and I learned much that was valuable, but I never did accept that ultimate assumption that was lurking in the background. But most students don't recognize the assumptions in the background, and therefore they cannot question it, they don't look for it, and so forth. Okay, so now let's see what else we can do. There are only a couple further things that we need to do to take thinking apart. It's to recognize that all thinking has implications. And that when you put thinking into action, it has consequences. And so knowing this, you say something to me, this is what we ought to do. I notice that the possibility of this question. Well, let's assume we do exactly what you want to do. What are the implications going to be? What are the financial implications of this? What are the legal implications of this? What are the practical implications of this? Or if we're at school, what are the implications for transportation? What are the implications for parent response? What are the implications for a school board response? So now we look at implications. If we do this, what follows? Because thinking always produces implications. Thinking not only begins somewhere, assumptions, it goes somewhere, implications. And so I check where thinking is going. Let's look at the implications of this thought. Where is this taking us? Let's look at the implications of our behavior together. Where is that leading us? Each argument seems to get a little worse. What's the implication? Where are we going with this? Do we want to be going there? Maybe we need to make some changes so that these implications that seem to be lurking do not become the implications. In fact, that is the consequences. And one final point that is crucial, whenever you're thinking, you are thinking within a point of view. Whenever you're thinking, you have an overall view of things. You see things from an angle, from a perspective. I am situated in the body of Richard Paul. Richard Paul is situated in a certain point in space. Richard Paul developed his early thinking in the city of Chicago. The reality of that experience has shaped my mind. I think with certain experiences in the background, and this is necessary for thought. I can certainly change my point of view and learn new points of view, and that's the purpose of education, certainly. So I can learn to think historically and economically and sociologically and psychologically and archaeologically and anthropologically, and that enriches my mind. But I'm always thinking within a frame of reference. I'm always thinking within a point of view. So the question can always be asked, what is your point of view? Or what is the point of view of this subject? What is it to look at things sociologically? What is it to look at things like a lawyer looks at things? What is it for a cosmetologist to come in here and look at us and see all these split ends? This is not what an architect is going to see who comes into this room. Or a fashion designer who looks around the room and can cite very quickly who is dressed in fashion and who isn't. So these are the essential elements of thought as I understand them. These are universal. And in a Socratic discussion, the one that we're going to do, I'm going to emphasize them. These are not the only things you can ask, but these are the questions you ask when you want to take thinking apart.